Inside San Quentin, Rikers Island and UK prisons, how food shortages fuel prison gangs across the US, Canada and Europe. Hunger doesn't just weaken the body. In prison, it rewires loyalty. When food becomes uncertain, men stop thinking in terms of right and wrong. They start thinking in terms of who controls the tray. The first thing to disappear isn't hope, it's independence. And once that happens, gangs don't recruit. They replace survival. This documentary contains descriptions of prison conditions and violence for educational purposes based on verified sources. Viewer discretion is advised. For more deep research of prison documentary like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Across prisons in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and parts of Europe, food is officially labeled a basic necessity. But inside the walls, it functions as something far more dangerous, a social weapon. Research from the National Institute of Justice, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, and prison psychologists like Dr. Craig Haney shows that chronic deprivation doesn't just create discomfort. It reshapes behavior, identity, and power structures. This documentary examines how food scarcity quietly accelerates gang dominance, alters inmate psychology, and transforms prisons into ecosystems where allegiance often begins at the stomach. This is not a story about bad meals. This is a story about how hunger reorganizes human behavior. When basic needs disappear, prison systems are designed around control, but control begins with predictability. When meals are consistent, inmates adapt. When they aren't, instability spreads faster than violence. According to data compiled by the NIJ and corroborated by multiple state-level audits, reductions in food budgets are frequently followed by increased inmate-on-inmate assaults, informal trading economies, strengthened racial and gang-based alliances. This is not coincidence. It's psychology. The American Psychological Association explains that when access to basic needs becomes unreliable, the brain shifts into survival mode. Long-term thinking collapses. Moral reasoning narrows. Social bonds reorganize around resource access rather than shared values. Inside prison, this shift happens quietly. An inmate housed in a California maximum security facility described it simply during a post-release interview reviewed by the CDCR. You stop asking if someone's dangerous. You ask if they eat. Food trays arrive late. Portions shrink. Nutritional value declines. None of this causes an immediate riot. Instead, it creates dependence. That's where gangs step in. Sociologist John Irwin, whose prison ethnographies remain foundational, documented how informal groups fill institutional gaps. When the system fails to meet basic needs, inmates form parallel systems. Gangs become supply chains. Not for drugs. For calories. At first, it's subtle. Someone offers commissary items. Someone else knows which kitchen worker can be pressured. Soon, food is pooled, rationed, and distributed, but only to those who align. This is the moment when hunger stops being personal and becomes political. And once survival is tied to affiliation, neutrality disappears. Prison psychologists warn that this stage marks a critical transformation. Identity shifts from individual to unit. The inmate is no longer asking how to endure prison, he's asking who will keep him fed. By the time correctional officers notice an increase in gang visibility, the hierarchy is already set. The power wasn't built with violence. It was built with bread. And what begins as hunger doesn't end with food. It ends with obedience. The cost of protection. Protection in prison is often described as something you earn through strength or reputation. That's a myth. According to longitudinal observations cited by the National Institute of Justice and behavioral analyses referenced by Dr. Craig Haney, protection more often begins with dependence, not dominance. Once food access is mediated by a group, it comes with expectations. Nothing is free. What starts as a shared meal quietly becomes an unspoken contract. Inmate interviews analyzed by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation show a consistent pattern. The first obligation is rarely violence. It's availability. You sit where you're told. You avoid who you're told to avoid. You listen. Psychologically, this stage is critical. The brain interprets consistent food access as safety. Over time, the source of that safety becomes emotionally charged. Survival becomes associated with faces, colors, and rules. This is how loyalty forms without ideology. The American Psychological Association describes this as conditioned security, when relief from deprivation strengthens attachment to whoever controls the relief. Inside prison, gangs understand this instinctively. A former federal inmate interviewed during a Chicago crime lab reentry study explained it this way. Once they fed you, they owned your attention. After that, they didn't have to threaten you. As weeks turn into months, expectations escalate. Not dramatically. Incrementally. A favor. A warning delivered. Standing nearby when tension rises. The danger here isn't coercion. It's normalization. By the time an inmate recognizes that affiliation has become obligation, his nervous system has already adapted. The group is no longer optional. It's familiar. Predictable. Leaving now doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like risk. This is where food-based alliances harden into something more durable than fear, identity. Gangs don't just supply calories. They supply belonging. And once belonging replaces isolation, the cost of exit becomes higher than the cost of compliance. But this transformation doesn't happen in isolation. It's reinforced daily by the environment itself. Because prison isn't just a place where gangs exist. It's a place where scarcity trains behavior. And that training doesn't stop at the gate. How hunger rewrites the brain. Hunger is often treated as a temporary condition. In prison, it becomes chronic. According to neuropsychological research referenced by the American Psychological Association and behavioral studies funded by the National Institute of Justice, prolonged deprivation alters how the brain evaluates risk, reward, and threat. This isn't theory. It's measurable. When food access is inconsistent, cortisol levels remain elevated. Decision-making becomes reactive. The prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for impulse control, loses influence to survival-driven circuitry. Inside prison, this shift has consequences. Correctional mental health assessments reviewed by the CDC found that inmates experiencing sustained food insecurity showed faster escalation from frustration to aggression, reduced tolerance for ambiguity, increased reliance on group cues rather than personal judgment. In practical terms, this means an inmate doesn't ask, "Is this a good idea?" He asks, "What keeps me safe right now?" A formerly incarcerated man interviewed during a Midwestern reentry evaluation described the change bluntly. "You don't plan fights. You react. And reacting feels smart when you're always hungry." This is where violence thresholds change. Sociologist John Irwin documented that under deprivation, minor conflicts are interpreted as existential threats. A perceived slight isn't about respect, it's about access. Access to food. Access to protection. Access to survival. Gangs exploit this altered perception. By controlling meals, commissary flow, or kitchen access, they don't need to demand aggression. They simply frame threats. The hungry brain fills in the rest. What's especially dangerous is that this conditioning doesn't turn off easily. Studies cited by the Chicago Crime Lab show that individuals released from environments of chronic scarcity often retain hypervigilance and group dependence behaviors long after basic needs are restored. The brain learned that safety came from alignment, not independence. That learning persists. This explains why some former inmates describe freedom as disorienting rather than relieving. Outside prison, food is abundant, but the instinct to attach survival to groups doesn't disappear overnight. Hunger trained the nervous system to seek structure. Gangs provided it. And once the brain associates structure with safety, chaos feels threatening, even when it's freedom. This is why deprivation inside prison doesn't stay inside prison. It reshapes behavior on the outside, fuels recidivism, and reinforces the very cycles prison systems claim to disrupt. But the system itself plays a role in sustaining this dynamic. Because scarcity isn't always accidental. Sometimes it's policy. When policy creates power vacuums. Food scarcity in prison is often framed as a logistical problem. Budget constraints. Staffing shortages. Supply chain failures. But research reviewed by the National Institute of Justice and audits conducted within multiple state systems show a more uncomfortable reality. Administrative decisions frequently create predictable power vacuums. When meal portions are reduced or quality declines, institutions rarely anticipate how quickly informal governance will emerge. Prisons are not neutral environments. They are closed systems. Sociologist John Irwin warned that when formal authority fails to meet basic needs, informal authority becomes legitimate in the eyes of inmates. Not moral authority, functional authority. A former correctional administrator interviewed in a policy review cited by the Chicago Crime Lab admitted, "When inmates start feeding each other, it means we've already lost control of something." Food-related cost-cutting often coincides with other stressors. Overcrowding, limited programming, reduced staff presence. Together, they weaken institutional credibility. In that gap, gangs don't just operate. They govern. They decide who eats when kitchens are understaffed. They mediate disputes tied to commissary debt. They enforce rules that feel immediate and reliable, unlike institutional promises. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation has acknowledged in internal assessments that disruptions to meal consistency correlate with increased disciplinary incidents tied to group activity. From the inmate perspective, this isn't ideological alignment. It's pragmatism. If the system cannot guarantee food, the system cannot guarantee safety. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. Administrators respond to gang activity with restrictions. Restrictions deepen scarcity. Scarcity increases reliance on gangs. No one intended to empower them. But intention doesn't matter inside closed systems. Psychologically, this environment teaches a single lesson. Stability comes from whoever delivers essentials. And when that lesson is reinforced daily, trust in formal authority erodes. By the time policy adjustments are made, the informal hierarchy has hardened. Gang structures have replaced institutional routines. Loyalty has shifted. Food was the entry point. Control is the outcome. But the most enduring impact of this dynamic isn't violence inside the walls. It's what inmates carry with them when they leave. Because the final transformation doesn't happen in prison. It happens after release. When the doors open but scarcity follows. Release from prison is often described as a return to freedom. For many, it's a return to uncertainty. Studies analyzed by the Chicago Crime Lab and behavioral research referenced by the American Psychological Association show that individuals leaving environments of chronic deprivation don't immediately recalibrate to abundance, even when food is available. The brain remembers instability. Former inmates frequently report eating quickly, hoarding groceries, or experiencing anxiety when meals are delayed. These behaviors aren't habits. They're conditioned responses. During a re-entry interview reviewed in a Midwestern study, one participant said, "I knew I could eat any time, but my body didn't believe it." This is where prison-formed alliances reassert themselves. Gangs that provided food and structure inside often become points of contact outside. Not because of loyalty alone, but because they represent familiar systems. Predictable rules. Known expectations. The National Institute of Justice has documented that individuals with strong in-prison affiliations face higher pressure to reconnect upon release, especially when housing, employment, and food access remain unstable. Scarcity doesn't need to be extreme to reactivate old pathways. A missed paycheck. A closed food pantry. An empty fridge. The nervous system recognizes the pattern before the conscious mind does. This explains why some individuals relapse into group dependence even when they want to stay independent. It's not a failure of will. It's a learned survival strategy resurfacing under stress. Sociologist John Irwin noted that prison culture doesn't end at release. It migrates. The rules adapt, but the logic remains. Align with those who reduce uncertainty. When society fails to provide stable re-entry support, the same dynamics repeat, just without walls. This is how food scarcity inside prison contributes to cycles of recidivism outside it. Not directly. Psychologically. But this cycle is not inevitable. Research also shows something else. When stability is restored early, these patterns weaken. Which brings us to the final question. If hunger helps build gangs, what happens when the system removes hunger as a variable? What happens when scarcity stops? When food becomes reliable, something unexpected happens inside prison walls. Tension drops, not dramatically, but measurably. Evaluations cited by the National Institute of Justice and Institutional Assessments within the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation show that facilities maintaining consistent meal quality and timing experience lower rates of group-based conflict, even when other stressors remain unchanged. This isn't because inmates become more cooperative. It's because dependence weakens. When the system meets basic needs predictably, gangs lose one of their most effective recruitment tools. Survival no longer requires affiliation. Psychologist Craig Haney has argued that humane conditions don't create softness, they create psychological stability. Stability allows individuals to think beyond the next meal, beyond immediate threats. In facilities where nutritional standards were improved as part of broader reforms, correctional reports noted reduced informal trading tied to food, fewer commissary-related disputes, decreased reliance on inmate-enforced order. These changes don't dismantle gangs overnight, but they limit their leverage. The key insight here is uncomfortable for many systems. Control through deprivation often backfires. It strengthens the very structures institutions are trying to suppress. Food stability doesn't eliminate violence by itself, but it removes a catalyst. And when that catalyst is gone, other interventions, education, mental health care, reentry planning, become more effective. The lesson is simple, but rarely applied. When hunger dominates attention, nothing else reaches the mind. Ending, what hunger taught you. Prison gangs are often explained through ideology, race, or criminal history. Those factors matter, but beneath them is something more basic. Hunger. Not dramatic starvation. Not sudden collapse. Chronic, low-level deprivation that trains the brain to seek safety through control and alignment. The research is clear. From NIJ studies to APA psychological analysis, from CDCR institutional data to decades of prison sociology, one conclusion repeats. When systems fail to meet basic needs, informal power replaces formal authority. Food is not just sustenance inside prison. It's structure. It's leverage. It's loyalty. Understanding this doesn't excuse violence. It explains it. And explanation is the first step toward change. If this documentary helped you see the prison system differently, consider subscribing. Not for sensationalism, but for deeper examinations of how environments shape human behavior. Because behind every wall, policy becomes psychology. And psychology becomes reality. Subscribe for more documented, research-based stories from behind the system.